So welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending today's lecture with Julie Cox. We are Aspire, and we work to improve lives of children and adults affected by PANS, PANDAS, and related encephalopathies. We work on trying to build usable tools and understandable information such as this webinar, so that our community can better share awareness materials as well as advocate for their patients, their students, and their own families. We do this by working with 5 core audiences, trying to reach them. So of course, that's the general public. Awareness is one thing, understanding is another. So we work on supporting families and patients by providing talks like these that are very much geared towards parents and caregivers, but we also have our website, we have toolkits, and all sorts of different things like that. And we have the Aspire Facebook page. So if you're a parent or an adult child with PANS or patient with PANS, welcome to join it. I will put the link into the chat eventually. We also work a lot with schools. I think that's sort of one of the main things I do during my week is lecturing at schools via Zoom. So we have a school nurse lecturer and a regular school staff lecture. We can work with small groups, and we work with very large groups. So one day I may have an audience of 5 and the next day it'll be 200. So we accommodate both. We do some work with public policy. We are obviously not the boots in the ground in each state. We rely on you guys to be that, but we provide letters of testimony and state pages so that you don't have to create anything. And we help you with all that. And we have state surveys and different ways to get information about your state on an individual basis. And we do provide our researchers and our providers where we are not PANDAS physicians at work. We're not writing all of the literature for doctors. We do have a wonderful toolkit that a lot of doctors really like. It helps them. It's a really good starting point for some of them. And then we provide literature to offices so that they can hand something to their new PANS patients. And we do other projects that we don't really talk a lot about, but we're always doing something in the background. So really, we're here to aspire to educate, and with webinars, I guess it's been about a year it's been less than a year that we've been hosting them, and we try to reach a lot of different peoples with a lot of different interests with behavioral health, integrative medicine, school support, family support, and of course, treatment and scientific updates. So today, this pretty much falls in 2 categories. It's that behavioral health category and that family and patient support category. Julie Cox is a social worker, and she will be talking about helping PANS families move from grief to empowerment. Julie and I have become friends over the years, and she's listened to me stress about my own family, and I've listened to her stress about her own family, and we talk about ways to empower our community so that they can be a better support to themselves and to their family. So she started as an undergraduate at Binghamton University, and she majored in psychology. Then she worked for 8 years in medical research at many institutions like UCLA and Columbia Medical Center. And lucky for us, she got out of the research lab and came to work face-to-face with families, and she's been doing that wonderfully for 20 years. And she, in her practices, she uses CBT, DBT, ACT, EMDR, and attachment-based interpersonal neurobiology. So she's really well equipped to understand and work with our community, and she does a wonderful job, and I'm really excited that she's here today so that we can all learn and grow together.
Thanks, everybody. I'm really glad everybody's here. I'm actually going to do a thank you slide to Gabriella in a second, but first I just want to welcome everybody, and I'm really excited you're here, and I hope to impart some helpful information today. So first of all, I've been on this path a really long time, and I know Gabriella has too. And back then, when we started, right? There was nothing. There was nothing out there. Okay. So I cannot say enough thanks to Aspire and Gabriella for all that they do, right? Because I am incredibly grateful for everything that is available, that all the work you've done. And I was thinking when you were introducing Aspire, that you don't just aspire, that you've really achieved. I don't mean to sound corny, but I think it's really incredible what you've done. So, okay. So I know Gabriella already introduced me. I'm Julie Cox. I've been a therapist, it's now 21 years, but just because I think I wrote up that intro last year. And more importantly, I have my own PANS child for the last 18 years. And, these are the two things that have really influenced my work the most. And if you notice, I put with raising my own PANS child, it's trial by fire. I've walked through it. I've, had no other choice but to learn how to navigate this path because I was on it. Okay. So as you know, the title for this is Moving from Grief to Empowerment. And I'm going to explain how I came up with that. So I really feel that PANS parents are superheroes, right? And we're superheroes with a strategy because, we do have these incredible gifts that I see in PANS parents: resiliency, dedication, commitment, eagerness to learn. And we have, a common goal to help our kids. Okay. So we take those strengths and we have to put them into a strategy. Okay. So if you look at this graphic, if you see at the top, right, our goal is to move from grief to empowerment as a PANS parent, a PANS family. And I put in these steps. These were the topics that I put together for the presentation. And it actually is a lot of material to cover. So I'm going to kind of I can't go super in depth about each one of them, but I'm hoping that this presentation will help you pull the big picture together, okay? Because it's really most effective if we can work from the bottom up, with the things that I'm talking about today. So, the first step, as you saw in the topic for the webinar, is acknowledging our grief as a PANS parent, right? And taking that as power to move towards action. Okay. And then the second step, and these are things that I came up with for myself. I was observing myself as a PANS parent and I was trying different things. I actually started to start at number 3. It didn't work very well. It was hit or miss. And same with the families that I've worked with. When I started at number 3, which is tools for the kids and the teens, it was somewhat effective. And what I really found was that we needed, number 1, we needed to acknowledge our losses and use that energy as, energy to move forward. We also need to implement some self-care and some self-regulation, and then layer in the tools for the kids. I'm not saying you can't start at different points in time. This is the ideal order that I have found to go in. So let's just start with the first part of the presentation. So when I say acknowledging grief and taking committed action, I like to use a form of therapy called ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. And what ACT does is ultimately it really helps calm the fight or flight response in the PANS parent by acknowledging the grief and the trauma that we've all been through. So I'm going to talk about that. So you may have seen, people talk about that the grief is real, right? So, we have different kinds of grief in the mental health world, there's something called complicated grief, and complicated grief means it's not just one loss. It means that there's a multitude of losses, and there's a multitude of unexpected changes, unexpected shifts. So PANS parenting really involves complicated grief. It also involves prolonged grief, because I remember, very early on thinking, okay, and I know Gabrielle and I have talked about this, that, okay, we got, this is good. I'm good now with my daughter. And what happens? The flare comes, right? So we're back in the cycle again. So it's prolonged, right? So when you have this kind of grief, you really need a game plan. You need to step back and you need to look at the big picture and say, you know what? I'm on a longer journey than I realized, right? What do I need in this backpack that I'm taking with me on this journey? It's not a one-day supply of water. It's not a week-long supply of food. We need more, right? And it's a really hard job as a PANS parent, because as human beings, our nervous systems are designed to seek validation and support from other people. We are, that's part of human nature, right? We're beings that work in groups. And because PANS is not well recognized, by the medical world or in general, although Aspire is making huge strides in that, PANS parents can't get the validation and support that they need to work through the grief, or at least it's a lot harder to work through the grief. So this happened for me, and maybe it happened for many of you as a PANS parent, but I got stuck in fight or flight because I was looking for validation. I was looking for support. I was looking for guidance. And, that part of me was coming up with very little. Thank goodness there's more now, right? That PANS parents can access. So when we're stuck in that fight or flight, we're having to manage so many different things, right? We're having to manage our own grief, and we're also having to manage our PANS kids' medical issues, mental health challenges, and their losses. I mean, that's really a superhero, a parent that's managing all of this. And we don't have to do it pretty, by the way. It definitely doesn't look pretty and just like that woman, that superhero woman in that picture. So some of the principles of ACT, which, like I said, is acceptance and commitment therapy, is that knowing that stress increases when we avoid grief, okay? And that, so when we avoid the feelings related to grief, right? The anger, the fear, the losses. So part of ACT is acknowledging our grief, okay? And that helps us move very gently towards acceptance that our child or teen has an illness. So, that was really hard for me to accept because I didn't have that external validation. It was people were telling me, it's in my head, or she's okay. What are you talking about? So, it's a rough road. Okay. And also it's important to accept that we cannot fix everything right away. And that was what my body and my mind wanted to do. I researched, I practiced, I implemented. And at some point I had to step back. That's what ACT is a lot about. One of the principles of it is what they call cognitive diffusion. Okay. And what that means is you're stepping back and you're looking at your situation and you're saying, this is big. Okay. I'm not going to fix all of this right away. So some of the ways that we can recognize our grief is that are the different stages of grief. You may have heard of these: shock, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Very similar for PANDAS parents as well. And when you know what stage you might be in, and this can change from hour to hour, day to day, week to week, when you know what stage you're in, it serves as what we call a cognitive anchor. So if you think of an anchor, right? An anchor is something that keeps a boat steady, keeps it from drifting off. Okay. So when we have an anchor in our mind, right, it calms the nervous system because you're bringing in logic to ease the emotions. We often say in the therapy world, if you can name it, you can tame it. Not perfectly, but a little bit. So this is also part of ACT, is that taking action also helps the nervous system, because the emotions of grief that we go through as PANDAS parents, those are energy in our nervous system, right? You hear about fight, flight, freeze, fawn. There's actually another one. There's many different types of nervous system reactions. But for us PANDAS parents, I have found it's really important that we really harness the fight energy, right? So that's where the advocating comes in. And that's where we can take action towards learning tools that we can use as a PANDAS parent. Okay. So other actions that PANDAS parents can take is seeking out validation and understanding from other PANDAS parents, through Aspire, through Facebook groups, through, a variety of ways, because that validation is really key to that nervous system regulation and allowing for that processing of that grief as PANDAS parents. And one thing I wanted to mention is sometimes you may need to temporarily reduce contact from non-supportive people in your life. I had to do this because it took a toll on me, and it impacted my ability to support my child. Okay, so we talked about step one. Okay, we're calming the fight or flight response in ourselves as PANDAS parents by acknowledging the grief, okay, and taking some action. And then the next step I find really helpful is helping PANDAS parents support themselves so that they can support their PANDAS kids or teens. And DBT skills are really helpful for self-regulation and self-care. So you might see I don't know if you're in my Facebook group or other Facebook groups or any, maybe Instagram, you'll see self-care. And it feels like such a luxury for us as PANDAS parents. And I know I think it annoyed me actually to hear that for a while, until I really understood the science behind it. Because as PANDAS parents, if we don't, I call it putting money in our own emotional bank account, right? If we don't put that money into our emotional bank account through self-care, our kids are doing constant withdrawals on our bank account, right? I was constantly in deficit because I couldn't keep up with all the challenges. And also, our PANDAS kids and teens are super reactive to their environment, as most of you know. Their alarm center in their brain is super overreactive. And so if we don't have money in that, or funds in that emotional bank account, it's really, really hard for us not to become reactive with our PANDAS kids and teens. I know for myself, that was the case with my daughter. So, implementing self-care helps us reduce reactivity to our PANDAS kids and teens. And that in turn increases what we call co-regulation. So co-regulation is a neuroscience term, but it's really pretty cool if you understand it. I think of it as this energy that goes back and forth between a parent and a child. And during co-regulation, if we're taking care of ourselves and our nervous system is calmer and we've, addressed some of those feelings of grief, our kids sense it. Okay. The co-regulation is a nonverbal process, and our kids, and especially because their brains are inflamed, they are reading every single little thing in us. It used to freak me out with my daughter because she would react to things that I didn't even know I was showing on my face. So I couldn't control all of that. We can't control all of that, but we can work towards having a calmer nervous system so that they feel calmer. There's something called mirror neurons, which are really cool. I worked in science, right? So mirror neurons are our brain's ability to feel what other people are feeling. So if we're calmer, our kids are going to feel it too. Don't take this as pressure, because I used to feel some pressure about that. Just take this as, okay, how can I learn more about this? Okay. So DBT skills, I don't know if you're familiar with dialectical behavior therapy. It's really an excellent approach for many, many different things, but it happens to have a whole module dedicated to emotional regulation. Okay. And I use it for myself, not just for clients and families, but for myself with my daughter, because I needed ways to self-regulate when she was reactive. So I want to talk about, let me just take a drink. I want to talk about a couple things in DBT, a couple of emotional regulation skills. Okay, so I know there's a lot here, so bear with me. So this diagram, right? If you look at number one, these are three different states of mind that you might be able to identify with. Okay. We have a part of us that thinks very logically, that we call it reason mind. Okay. It's completely focused on the facts. It's task focused, and it's what we call cool mind. Okay. It's the non-reactive mind. It's like a computer, it's that logical math side of you. And then if you look at, I'm going to go to number 3, okay, which is emotion mind. That's another part of us where we're fully in the emotions. We're ruled by feelings. We often call this hot mind, reactive mind. Now, I spent a great deal of my PANDAS parenting in emotion mind, but I took that action forward, and I had to learn about the facts, right? And eventually you bring these two together, because both of these states of mind are important, but you're going to blend them to what we call wise mind. Okay. And wise mind is, Gabriella and I were actually talking about this before we got on. It's that part of you where you, I don't know if you can relate to this, but where you kind of get centered in yourself. It's intuition, it's middle path. It's that combination of your logic and understanding with your emotions, right? And you bringing them together. And we validate our emotions and also remember the facts and our skills. So I want to give you an example as a PANDAS parent. So, if I'm using my reason mind as a PANDAS parent, I'm recognizing that my PANDAS child or teen has an illness that affects their behavior. I'm recognizing I did not cause my PANDAS child or teen's illness. That was one for me I had to recognize. And I'm recognizing the fact, these are all facts, that my PANDAS child or teen struggles to regulate their emotions. So this is your logical mind side, right? And then you go to your emotion side, your emotion mind. This is how I felt a lot of the time. Maybe you can relate. I feel overwhelmed. by my PANS child or teen's reactions. A big one for me, what my emotion was, I wish this was not happening. Like, I wanted to run away. I really did. I was like, I got to return her. That was my big, that was something I used to think about. And, you know, we have to be honest about this because this is how it feels. These are real emotions. They weren't facts. They weren't actions that I was going to take, but that's how I felt, right? I wanted to yell back at her, you know, because I didn't know what to do. Eventually, you know, luckily I didn't act too often on the emotions. Sometimes I did, I yelled, you know, but I strove towards wise mind. Okay. I validated my emotions. It made sense that I'm overwhelmed. This isn't crazy situation that we've been given, right? So I can acknowledge my emotions, and I'm also going to recognize the facts of the situation, because that's going to help me balance out. Okay. So that was number 2, you know, on this pathway that I'm talking about, you know, learning self-care and self-regulation, because then we can move towards how do we help our kids and our teens. Okay. And here I'm going to talk about space. You know, and that's reducing accommodations. And, you know, I'll tell you why I used, oh, wow, there we go. That glitched for a second. So SPACE stands for supportive parenting for anxious childhood emotions. And I'll tell you just a little background first, and then I'll explain why I wanted to talk about SPACE in particular. So Ellie Leibowitz created SPACE. He's out of the Yale Child Study Center. And it's pretty cool because if you do the SPACE training, you get to train with him and ask him questions, which I just really enjoyed the training. So you can go to spacetreatment.net and learn more about SPACE. There's a very large research study that he did showing the effectiveness of this approach. Okay. And you can also find practitioners on that website. And he also wrote the book, Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD, that you can get on Amazon. Just, you know that it's not super easy to implement all these steps on your own. So don't walk away. I don't want you to immediately apply all of this if you're walking away from the webinar today. Just use it as information to learn right now. So, and part of the reason why I wanted to talk about SPACE is because I think SPACE is really a great fit for PANS families, because a lot of our kids and teens don't want to participate in therapy. Okay. And the nice thing about SPACE is you're actually working with the parents and you're focusing on what parents can change. You're not focusing on changing your child or teen's behavior. And this is confusing, you know, at first, because you're like, how does this work? Right. But it focuses on reducing accommodations. And just in case people don't know what accommodations mean, you know, when it comes to anxiety or OCD, basically accommodations are ways that, you know, we as parents might do certain things for our PANS kids and teens that we would not do for another child that doesn't have anxiety or OCD. And so what he found in his research was that reducing accommodations actually by the parents actually indirectly reduced anxiety and OCD symptoms in the kids and the teens. And I found this fascinating. I happen to like research, but he did really rigorous studying and really, you know, rigorous assessment pre and post of the kids and teens that were in the study. And they had a significant reduction in anxiety and OCD just from their parents making certain changes. So it's important to understand what support means in SPACE, right? So support has a specific definition in space, and it's really an approach of combining validation for the child or the teen of what they're experiencing. Because, like we talked about earlier in the webinar, validation is really important for the nervous system to settle down and be able to engage in a learning process. So it's a combination of validation for the child or teen's emotions combined with encouragement of the ability to handle distress, okay, that comes when you're facing some of these things. So in space, he has you create what he calls a supportive statement. This is just an example. I think I don't know if I use this exact one with my daughter, but I would something like this, right? Like, I know it's really stressful for you to not get reassurance that nothing bad will happen, but I'm also confident that you'll get through it. Now, don't expect your kid or teen to like this, okay? They're not going to like it. And you really want to be strategic about which accommodations you're reducing. I hope that makes sense. So first, so he does space in a certain order, right? So he talks about, before you identify accommodations, just understanding that support approach to get that foundation first. And then you go to identifying accommodations. And so, like I said, accommodations are things that you might do for your PANDAS child or teen that you wouldn't do for a child or a teen that didn't have anxiety or OCD. And you're not going to pick the first one on your list, okay? You really have, this is why I said, don't just jump in and do this. You really, either go through the book or work with a practitioner on this, because you need some help figuring out where you're going to start. And especially because our PANDAS kids and teens are so reactive, we often need to start smaller than you would with a kid that had anxiety and OCD and didn't have PANDAS. And you're choosing one accommodation to reduce. And like I said, it's based on certain criteria, okay? And often it's, is it something that's really important to the parents is one of the criteria, okay? And something that the parents feel motivated, to reduce accommodation, knowing that when you reduce that accommodation, there's going to be a reaction from the child or teen. And then, I put 5 steps of space. There's actually more steps, but I tried to kind of summarize it. So I'm saying step 5, this is really big for PANDAS families, that you really have to troubleshoot the reactions that you're going to get, because you could get, you have to be careful, right? If it's going to create a physical response, if, the emotional response is bigger than you can manage, you really need to be strategic about what accommodation you're going to reduce. How am I doing on time? Doing okay, right? Okay. So, all right, let's move forward. So there's like a map here, right, for the steps of space. And I'm going to go into a little more depth on each one. So, and I think one of the questions that was submitted ahead of time was, I think, how is space different from ERP? So like I said, the first approach is recognizing that space is having the focus on what parents are doing. So a lot of times, I'll see families that are saying, okay, we need her to, stop using electronics, right? Well, this is different with space, right? So it's, what can you do as a parent? What are you going to shift? So it might be, I'm going to shift, how, please don't go and do this right away, but, how often I have the Wi-Fi on, right? That's something a parent can change. And it is very similar to ERP, right? Because ERP, exposure and response prevention, is being exposed to something that would be anxiety producing or an obsession, and its ERP is based on a learning theory where the mind and the brain learns over time that whatever that anxiety, provoking situation or that obsession is not dangerous. It used to be called habituation, where you get used to something. They're now shifting it towards a learning model. But basically, when you're reducing accommodations, it does, in fact, create an exposure to some degree, because whether it's, a reduction in accommodation of staying with your child for a long time in a situation that they were afraid of, right? If you're planning on reducing that accommodation, they'll be exposed to that anxiety of, a little bit more of being in that situation that they consider, fearful, that it's a situation they're scared of. Or, like I said, if you're reducing an accommodation, that might relate to an obsession. So earlier I talked about reassurance. Reassurance is a common compulsion. And when you say to, for example, a PANDAS child or teen, one of the accommodations I'm going to reduce is providing reassurance, when there's an obsession. It could be a reassurance around contamination. So ERP and space are very similar, but the focus is what the parent is doing. And when the parent is reducing accommodation, it often results in an exposure. I hope that makes sense. So, and like I said, it's really important to understand what support means in space. So support means validating the discomfort for your PANDAS child or teen, because it's real. I mean, if you've been through it yourself, it's the pain of anxiety or an obsession, and not being able to engage in a compulsion is very painful, right? So we really have to validate that and honor that. We also have to hold that bigger picture for our kids and our teens, right? We have to, we're their source of understanding the world. So if we're providing confidence that they'll be able to handle it, it doesn't mean they're believing us, just so you know, okay? But we have to provide that confidence so that they can, step into that discomfort. And so Eli Leibowitz, when he did this research study, he found that these two components, the validation of the discomfort and providing the confidence, were completely key to this whole intervention. And, when I've done it with families, they're like, it almost seems too simple in some ways. And then when they use their supportive statement, it doesn't always work, but I've had a couple of families where they're like, this is magic. This is really magic. So I'm not saying it will definitely be magic, but it helps you understand, and he did do a lot of research to really show that, these pieces are important. So like I said, when you're identifying accommodations, you're looking at, what do you do for your PANDAS child or teen that you wouldn't do, for a child that didn't have anxiety and OCD? So maybe I can give you an example. There's something I've been trying to reduce for my daughter, is that I clean up after her. And it seems kind of irrelevant, right? I mean, she's kind of further along in the journey, but it's something that I've gotten used to doing, is cleaning up after her. I have to make the announcement to her, because that's part of space, that I'm not going to do that any longer, and she's going to have to take, ownership of that. But that's one of the things that, if she hadn't had PANDAS, that I wouldn't be doing for her, because she just wasn't well for so long. She really just, couldn't do so many things on her own. So like I said, choosing the problem, you want to use really specific criteria around this. I'm gonna move my picture out of the way. And you also, there's a step in space, and it goes much more in depth into it in the book, if you get the book, but you basically inform them. It's actually a written letter that you're informing them. And the letter, it's a very supportive letter. It says, dear so and so, we know this is really hard for you. We recognize that, and we see how hard you work, and we see all that you've been up against, right? Validation. And then the second part is taking that ownership as a parent and saying, we're also recognizing that by doing X accommodation, we're not really helping you, right? And it's a specifically chosen accommodation. Because you don't have to go into detail in the letter, but basically you're letting them know that by doing this for them, you're preventing them from having certain opportunities to work through anxiety or, obsessions or compulsions, and that you want them to have a full life. So very gradually, you would be, supporting them. You're helping them in the long run. Because I think for a long time, I felt like, was I creating trauma by doing this? It took me a long time to work through that and really understand not only, what accommodations are appropriate to reduce, but also it has to be through the lens of working with a PANDAS child or teen, because, they've had extra to deal with. So you can't be too cautious about what accommodations you're going to reduce, but you do have to be very sensitive about it, when you're doing it. And then, so one thing I think is so helpful that Dr. Leibowitz talks about is that a lot of times you'll get argument, debate, after that letter is given to the child or the teen, and how important it is not to get pulled into discussion around it. So he talks about recognizing that those arguments about reducing the accommodation are actually an anxiety response, right? And so they did, this is the science that I love. They did functional MRIs where it was not with accommodation reduction, but it was sort of taking that data that they did and applying it to this to space. But what they saw was that when a kid had anxiety, and if the parent engaged too much with them, it actually, the parts of the brain that show heightened anxiety increased in the child. And so it's recognizing, and I didn't recognize this for myself because I was staying very engaged with my daughter, and I'm not saying disengage to the extent where you're not supportive, but you have to be careful about talking too much. You have to be careful about engaging, really kind of what I call talking to the anxiety, because it'll pull you into all kinds of discussions, arguments, that it feels like, at least for me, it felt like my child needed me, right? And I wasn't, so I thought I was responding and all that, and it really wasn't helping. It was actually causing her anxiety to light up more. So, learning that sometimes disengaging, so especially if it's an argument, disengaging, you have to figure out how to do that with a PANDAS kid. That's a whole nother discussion. But not engaging in the argument. And you can stay supportive, but step out of their anxiety or the OCD. Make sure you're not talking to the anxiety or the OCD. Okay. So that's what I put together as for today's presentation to really create a bigger picture, right? Because we definitely need those tools for our kids and teens. And like I said, I chose space today because I think it's one therapy approach that is, I think, very helpful for PANDS families, because you can work with the parent and, they're willing typically, where, kids and teens may not be. But having, that foundational piece, right, of recognizing the grief and the loss, and then also implementing some self-care and self-regulation, those are really going to set you up well to use a tool like space or some other space. Okay. So just a quick reminder, in all of this, slow but steady wins the race. I was not very good at this. I tried to do it all really fast, and you know what? You end up not exactly back where you started, but if you push too fast, you're not going to necessarily gain ground. Okay. And I know that's hard because we want our kids to be better. I really get it. I really get it. So that's, we want our kids to be better, emotion, mind. But the facts are, how do we do this strategically, right? If that emotion mind, that reason mind, bring us into wise mind. So important to get ourselves prepared for this journey, this longer journey than we expect. Okay. So I have a question slide, but I think you do too, Gabriella.
Yeah. So
should I stop sharing?
Yeah, you can stop sharing your screen and everything.
Okay.
Pretty much the biggest question is, we always talk about the treatment triangle. 1, remove the source of inflammation. 2, work on the dysregulated immune system. 3, work on the psychotherapeutic portion as needed for as long as needed. And all within an individual based care. And the difference between using ERP in PANS versus regular OCD is we don't do it in the height of the flare. And finding that height of the flare is like, that's the $1 million question for most families. Like, how do you know? Because we know that some, we can be in the height of the flare, you get some medical treatment, maybe not all of it, they're not done, you may not have gotten all of it, but some of that inflammation is reduced. But we're still trying to find that sweet spot, and it's difficult. I mean, I know I have difficulty with it. You've had difficulty. We've all had difficulty with it. But then there's the idea that a lot of parents push it way too far. And at that point, because we know that a lot of symptoms, especially on our first or second to whatever flare, symptoms aren't always going back to baseline. So some of them may go back to baseline, but not everything. So we can't expect to implement therapy once everything goes back to baseline, because then you wouldn't need it. But the reality is that obviously you don't. So with the space and the ERP and the ACT and all of that, it seems to me, and let me know, I guess I haven't really put this in a form of question, we kind of spaced that out. So pretty much as soon as they're in the flare, we're doing that ACT part where we're, accepting that this is their issue, and we're saying, okay, here's our whatever, our 3 brains and whatever, and we start that then. And then, is that right? And then from there, when we do the space, we're starting to learn, because a lot of times, do you feel that most of us don't always know how much we're accommodating and everything we're accommodating, especially if it's sort of that pure O where they're having the mental compulsions? How do you tease that out, like with so you've got to do that, and then you've got to start. So that's part of the process. So they are still not able to engage, but we're starting to learn. So you're starting to learn that pretty quickly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So then I guess the actual question might be like, when do you start like that writing the letter business, right? Is that an actual letter, like, or is that a text? Because I'm dealing with
an actual letter.
Something. I mean, my husband has a printer. I don't have a printer. Like, do I have to print it?
No, you don't have to print it.
Like, can I?
No, you can write it.
Like,
and listen, I'm keeping fidelity to his process, right? Because it's not mine.
Yeah.
He created it, and the research was based on very specific things, so for good outcomes, right? So I don't want to take any liberty of changing anything. What I do find, though, is we end up tweaking it a bit. Sorry, Ellie. You know, just a tiny bit, not
Yeah.
so much in steps,
Yeah.
but it's the pace. It's
Yeah.
a lot of times, in therapy, we talk about, we're looking at frequency, intensity, and duration, right? Sometimes I call it FID, so how often, right, are the symptoms like the anxiety and OCD occurring? How intense are they? And how long are they lasting, right? So we're using those as, markers of understanding symptoms. So what I find is, your reduction in accommodation, and this goes across the board with all the approaches I've used with PANS kids or PANS families, is we're doing much smaller steps.
Yeah.
Right.
You have to do them, because if you don't, I mean, if you're only picking at like the lowest hanging fruit, not their biggest OCD, that's, preventing them from getting out the door. Say like their biggest OCD prevents them from getting out the door. That's not what you're starting with, right? It's like
Typically not.
maybe some simple, quote unquote, simple reassurance OCD, where you're not reassuring that one all the time, right?
So with ERP, you're creating a hierarchy typically, right? So a hierarchy means, you're rating how intense your anxiety or obsession compulsion is. And you typically work, you don't always pick the highest. You obviously typically don't pick the highest on the hierarchy, right? You might start with something that, on a 0 to 10 scale is like a 3 or a 4, right? And you're looking at the hierarchy. You're also looking at what we call the subjective units of distress, a SUD, right? A SUD is a 0 to 10 scale of how distressing, that obsession compulsion is or whatever. So you're doing that with ERP, and that's going to help you pick where you're going to start your exposures. But with space, he doesn't do that. It's more left up to a discussion with the therapist and the family. In the book, I don't think he guides you on which one to pick, except that, you want to pick one that you're motivated. The parents feel motivated to address. And you want to be prepared for the reaction. You want to feel like you're in a position to handle any response. And so, a lot of times the kids with anxiety and OCD that he's writing about, I don't know if the parents have ever tried reducing accommodation. I think lots of PANS parents have, right? And they've seen the reaction, and it can be like kaboom, So you have to really feel you're going to pick something that is not going to throw such, upheaval into the family, because it's going, number one, it's not likely to be effective, right? So when there's too much distress, the learning process is not very effective. And that's really what exposure or space is. Like I said, it's a, chemical learning process that occurs in the kid's or teen's brain. You're changing neural pathways, right? And if the stress is too high, it's going to override that new learning pathway. So you're picking something that's not way too distressing, and you also want to make sure you can manage the reaction. So there is something in space that they call supporters, and that often you bring in what we call a supporter. So a supporter can be a neighbor, a family friend. It's an outside person that when the kid or teen is having a really strong response, I don't know if Ellie showed this in his particular research, but it is known, because I've seen it before too, that when you bring in an outsider, a lot of times these kids will shift out of that anger mode, and you might see that often with a PANS kid or teen. So some of the work, if it's needed, is identifying supporters, to help you mitigate some of those responses from reducing the accommodations. So I don't know if that answers the question.
I mean, yeah, it's really, there's no finite answer. Like it's going to be highly dependent on you and your kid and where they are in their medical treatments.
Right.
Um, you know, and then, if you had a kid, or say you have a late teen, early adult that has had newly diagnosed PANS, but they've clearly had it for many years and they've never done much of the medical.
Mhm.
And I guess it's probably a twofold question. But if they really haven't done any of the therapy, or you haven't done any space, can you still use it to a late diagnosed child or adult?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're speaking to, if I'm getting it, is neuroplasticity, right? So that the brain can continue to change and grow new pathways, right? Because that's really what's happening when you're doing therapy. I mean, to me, it's kind of interesting. It's fascinating, right? Like we're going into therapy and we're actually creating new pathways in our brain. That's pretty cool. So, but my limited understanding of neuroscience would be that, the older you are, changing some of those pathways may take longer. And especially then if you put inflammation on top, right? Really I find is that going slower and more time are sometimes, what's needed in those kinds of cases.
And so then, because of the relapsing remitting nature of PANS, whether or not we come back to baseline on certain symptoms or not, we still have the spike of symptoms at exposure with a slow sawtooth reduction of symptoms with treatment. During those spikes, that's, we pull back on what we do. So like, say you wrote a letter and you've progressed towards that one small thing you're working towards not accommodating,
Right.
and or whatever stage you're on, whether it's small or large. Okay.
Yes.
Then do you sort of like pull back that letter and say, all right, all bets are off. I will accommodate more now that you're in this acute medical flare?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, as you know, space isn't designed for PANS, right? So I'm taking the liberty of using it in that, for PANS families, and I have used it with my daughter. So I can relate to what you're saying because, she got sick recently and we've had a bit of a flare. And one of the things we were working really hard on was increasing her exposures with doing social things. And, when she's flaring, she's just not as able, right? So, if you've done a letter like that, I think it's also, my daughter's had to get used to me saying, this is a flare. Sometimes we adjust what we're doing. Right. So I don't, I think what you're saying is that maybe it could be confusing because you're pulling back during flares. And yes, to some degree, but what I have found with my daughter and other families is they kind of have to learn how to ride these flares, right? So I do a lot of teaching, with the families and with my daughter of, okay, let's step back, let's look, right? So things are worse right now. Why are things worse right now? You're having more fear of engaging with friends right now. Okay, no judgment, right? No shaming. It's a recognition, it's an acknowledgement, it's a validation that it's harder for her right now. And we talk about how, that's from the PANS, that's from the inflammation. And that I kind of gauge with her, like, can you take a smaller step? Like, maybe you don't want to see someone, but can you send a text? And, we're at a point now where she can kind of gauge what she can do and can't do. Right. So she'll say to me, maybe, and then I have to disengage at that moment because I know it stressed her. And now she'll come back to me and say, I could send a text. Right. So I think I'm answering what you're saying is that I think we have to be open to modifying, the intensity of it and providing that recognition that their abilities are going to wax and wane at times, with the flares. So it's a lot of pivoting. It's a lot of pivoting, as all of you know, right?
And then say you have a kid who was undiagnosed or misdiagnosed for many years, and they didn't get the medical treatment, and they only got super intense ERP, or a super intense ERP was tried on them. And that obviously causes vast amounts of trauma. So for those patients, do you suggest doing something like EMDR to work with the trauma first, or is there?
I get what you're saying completely, because there's so many pieces to this. There are so many pieces. And so I'm a little cautious about jumping to EMDR. And I'll tell you why. Because that stirs up things too, right? So I think what's most helpful, and I do have a couple of cases like what you're referring to, and it's really, using either the relationship with the therapist or the relationship with the parent to help them gain some self-regulation tools, right? So to gain, this is not your fault. Like that has to be said over and over and over and over again. You didn't choose this, so just eliminating, right? Like that shame and any feelings of responsibility. So a lot of, using the relationship, using that co-regulation, like we're in this together. You're not alone in this anymore. We're a team now. So really just helping them reestablish a sense of, confidence back in themselves, because this illness takes away so many things from them, and just really validating that and working with them on, understanding and letting them tell their story, letting them tell the story. Because, for most of these kids, it's been, at least, the ones I've known, it's the doctors telling them, what's happening, or other people telling them what's happening, but they need to be heard, right? Their experience, what it's been like for them, process some of those emotions just through typical therapy. And that if they're, you can move into EMDR, but I wouldn't start there in that situation.
Okay.
Because so sorry, I just want to mention one quick thing. So, is it okay if I add one thing to that? Okay.
Please do.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So EMDR has 8 phases to it. And, one of those phases is processing trauma. A big part of EMDR is stabilization. Okay. So EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, right? You're basically using what we call bilateral stimulation. And what they're discovering is that the bilateral stimulation actually taxes the working memory and allows memories and emotions to come to the surface and move through. So it's kind of like, what they found was that limbic system got all congested. with a trauma. Okay, so you have to kind of access a certain part of the brain to allow it to unclog. Those are my words. But it's super important part of EMDR is stabilization. And that's really getting them using the bilateral stimulation to help, kids, teens, parents to gain, to help the nervous system regulate. So sometimes that's all you do. There's something called EMD. It's really just stabilization. It's really just bringing in, a positive, nervous system experience to stabilize. So I just wanted to add that piece to it.
No, I think that's an excellent point to add. So, in that other part of the talk about the parents and the self-care that we give ourselves, that doesn't mean doing our nails, because God forbid. That's
I know, I never explained that well. I have to give it.
Yeah, a lot of us have PTSD from this. Like, as soon as my kid is in a bad mood, I am immediately like, I'm like, oh my God, he's going to start screaming at me. He's going to start screaming at me and saying something. We had it this morning and I was like, okay, I have to calm myself down. I have to calm myself down. And he didn't, but like it's always there. It's like, so, and then other parents have it much more extreme examples of this, and they always like physically flinch because they've been hit by their kid and things like that, and just dealing with all these doctors who don't listen, and there's just a lot of trauma. So if EMDR for our parents, would that be good too? Maybe a better idea for some of them?
I think it's a great idea. I think that this is my opinion, because just as an EMDR therapist, you want to make sure there's a decent amount of stabilization, and so what I mean by stabilization is, think of fight or flight as, your body moving, your nervous system, like pressing the gas way up, right? And then coming down and pressing, it's very draining. So, the stabilization component of EMDR can just help kind of slow those, jagged ups and downs to kind of bring, how the nervous system responds into what we call like more of a window of tolerance. Okay. It's like, we have normal ups and downs, but they might not completely dysregulate us. So, I have found with the PANDAS parents that I've worked with, I do a lot more stabilization with EMDR than processing. That's a later phase. Again, I think it's, you have to modify some of these approaches to the situation.
Yeah. I mean, and a lot of time it's not really post, we're just living in trauma.
Well, that's the other thing, right?
I mean, we're all like post, like cares about post. What about like this week?
I kept thinking post was coming, and that was part of the trauma. It was like,
when's my post?
I know.
Aren't I owed it yet?
Yeah. Well, so we call it like acute stress response, right? We're all kind of, to some degree, Yeah,
it's a much better word. I mean,
yeah,
we can take P's out of a lot of things, pediatric, post, P's not my favorite letter these days, I'll tell you. Just saying.
You're right.
Anyway, so how do listeners either work with you? I know you put up a page about looking at space programs and a couple of books for was it an HCT or a DPT book? I don't remember, but it'll also be on our website. But you have a course that I know you're launching soon. Can you just talk a little bit about that with us?
Sure. So in the course, there's 4 modules. There's an extra module, which I was like, I don't know how everyone's going to feel about number 5, but for the first 4 modules, it's a lot of what I talked about today. So it goes more in depth. So it's talking about the grieving process, acknowledging where we are in the grieving process, allowing feelings, but also, it's hard as a PANDAS parent. So we don't really have much, there's not a lot of luxury of just, experiencing your feelings, right? So that's why I like ACT, because ACT helps you acknowledge acceptance and commitment therapy. The premise is acknowledging the feelings, but also how do you move into action? Because that's kind of what we have to do, so moving into action. And so that's really the first module. And there's certain ways in ACT that help you identify how to move into action. Okay. And then the second module is self-care and self-regulation. So it goes much more into the tools around that. And it talks about ways to do self-care, different ideas, and there's a ton of worksheets that go with everything. And then the third module is I actually go through what I think are the 6 primary mental health, challenges for the PANS kids and teens. I'm open to knowing if I missed any from people, but, looking at anxiety, OCD, depressive symptoms, executive functioning, oppositional, defiance, anger, and then trauma and chronic stress. And I go into each of those and I give, tools, like basically a step-by-step how you could apply some of this to helping, your child or teen with those different areas. And then the fourth module, I put together what I call the PANS parenting toolkit, and it's these different mindset shifts. Some of them are pulled from different therapies, but it's also using different images to to help you anchor your tools, right? So just a variety of tools. And then 5, I kind of laugh at this one because it's bringing a little bit of lightness into your PANS family. And I know that feels like so much of a luxury, so that's why it was like a bonus, because if you can do it, you can. If you can't, you can't, right? So finding small ways, like, I used to try to sing with my daughter, just to relieve some of the stress, because you're living in it nonstop. So there's just different ideas in there about how to do that.
Yeah. Xander and I play video games together.
I love that.
Yeah, now I play too many video games, so I don't know.
Listen, we do.
But I'm really the best in my alliance right now, so I just won a big war. So I'm quite pleased with myself.
Yes.
Yay, me. But yeah, you got to find something. Like part of it was just, trying to escape a situation, sitting in a doctor's office, which is very stressful. I'm like, can you show me how to play this game? I don't know what the heck I'm doing. And, finding like a little bit of calm in the absolute trauma of sitting in this doctor's office, who is like, oh yeah, well that doesn't exist. PANDAS doesn't exist. And he's like,
I know. It's
like, look of like, the hell is happening here?
That's the thing. Like, that's why I feel like we are superheroes. Like, who faces this day in, day out? I mean, I remember feeling like, I studied all this and I'm like, there's nothing that compares to this. I was a therapist before I had my daughter for a few years, and I was like, this just blew the top off everything I knew. It was just, I'm like, I'm going to have to do a lot here. It's so big. So yeah, bringing in a little bit, right? Like something to distract, something fun, something, light during really hard times.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, so I think this was really good. And I know that a lot of parents feel validated just hearing other people in the chat and listening to us prattle on about certain things like video games, that, it is stressful, and we see you, and we like live and breathe it daily, minute by minute, like not just daily. Like I always hated that phrase, take it day by day. And I'm like, a day by day? That's way too long of a chunk of time. I know. Like we're at minute to minute here. So yeah, like you're seeing
it down, baby, right? That's just way too big.
Way too big. Like the idea of getting through a day when I'm trying to get through the night of him standing at the top of the stairs so he doesn't run out of the house. That's minute by minute. What are you going to do?
I know. And just like developing a little bit of an observing self where you're like, whoa, look at what I've been doing. Right. And in my head, I used to make it into like almost a comedy in my head. It was like a show.
Who could make this up? Like, I worked with a therapist for myself, and she didn't know one thing about PANDAS. And, so there's part of it explaining it, and part of it is just, she gets the grief, she gets the trauma, that doesn't need any explanation. But then she like listens to stories and she's like, Jesus, you're dealing with like tremendous amounts of stress. Like, you're just surviving, and it's just, sometimes that's what you're doing. And so, sometimes you have to do that before you can help your kid, like, like, and plus, I was diagnosed as PANS as an adult, and as some of the people who were here earlier, they know my mom's on, so she's probably like, yes, I accommodate a lot of her reassurance seeking. You're still required to do so. You're not getting out of it, or I will have a fit, because
not all of it's bad, though. We do need support.
Sometimes I just need it as a mom. Sometimes I need it as a PANS patient. Depends where I am. I'm not in a flare right now.
No, 100%, 100%. Like, I hear myself say to my daughter, "It's gonna be okay," and I'm like,
right.
Oh, but you know what? Sometimes she needs to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is too lonely. This is too hard.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. One of my kids going off to the asthma doctor with his father, and that was always like, he had to keep going there during some really dark times of his. So I know the whole day is, he doesn't want to go. And then he found out I wasn't going with him. And I immediately say, I could meet you there. Like, let me accommodate their stress, because just going there is stressful. So like, I am accommodating by saying I could be there, but he's also going. So like, because that's already an exposure. Like, he doesn't need to. Exactly. But he was like, no, I don't need you to come. I was like, okay. And then I immediately thought in my head, like, should I have offered? But then, well, yeah, because, he needs to be reassured too. So it's always like, we sit here and we're like, did we do too much? Did we do not enough? Is that the part that we say we saw you? Or is that a reassurance?
I know. And you know what I say? Here's a reassurance. Don't worry about it. You pick, it's not super important. If you chip away at it, right? And you do your best, you're still making progress, right? Yeah. And you try to pick one particular thing, right? And you make it small.
Yeah.
But I think it's worse for us as PANS parents if we start second guessing ourselves. It's like, we don't need that extra stress.
Right. Yeah, definitely not. I don't need to put more pressure on us on a stressful. But it's hard not to, your mom.
I know you're trying to measure
and to do.
Right. And also, like you said, like, he's already having an exposure. You don't need, right? Like, it's okay to, do small pieces. You don't have to, also reduce another accommodation.
Yeah. But, you talked about, you're like, would I be doing this for somebody their age? And, so today, as we're filling out his pre-medical thing, he was really in a bad mood. And I said, you could be doing this as an adult. And I said, but I will continue to help you. But I just was like, it was like just a small check, and he's not in a flare right now. So, I have a little bit more room to do that. So like, I take that room to do that. It's like, everybody keeps asking, what's the timing? Well, there's no timing. Like, you have to figure it out. Like, you have to just keep moving forward.
Yeah.
Yourself with them, trying to figure it out. Like, and if they're back in a flare, that timing may change again. So there isn't going to be one set timing for flare or kid.
I know. And that's hard, right? And I also think the baseline in space is different than it is for us, right? So saying that you wouldn't do this for another child or teen with anxiety and OCD, but they have PANS on top of it. They have inflammation. It challenges their abilities, right? And plus, my daughter is still catching up developmentally because of everything that she's gone through. Absolutely. So to have that expectation, you have to really, like, I like the word titrate, and I worked in the lab too. So we had to titrate, right? So it means like, you feel it out and you just give a little bit, but you'd sense is this really too much, right? Because sometimes it's just too much. And so, finding small ways that you can reduce accommodations, I think, is the best way to do it. Slow and steady.
Okay, we've taken up enough of everybody's
No,
time,
thank
but
you.
thank
Thank
you. I
you.
know we just chatted a lot and it really was more of a chat than a discussion, but I was really just trying to impart that you go at your own pace bit and so that we all go through it too. I also urge everybody to sign up. Even if you're not going to sign up for a course, sign up for Julie's newsletter. I love getting it, and follow her on Instagram because it's like small bits of information. So you're not like piled in at once. It's not like taking a class, you get a little bit of like, I see you. It's a great newsletter. So when I do the post production of this, I'll put in a link to all of that, and it's already on our website. And I'll put a link to your Facebook group and things like that. So it'll all be up there, and email us anytime. Join our Aspire Facebook group as well. Would love to have you. Just post stuff. And sometimes it gets a little quiet in there. It doesn't need to be. So don't be shy. And I will talk to you soon and hope everybody comes back at the end of the month for Sheila's talk and in December for Patty's talk. We'll put out the 2023 calendar at some point, but it's being made. Just eventually you'll find out what they are. But thank you, Julie.
Great.
And
Thank
I'm
you for
so
all you
glad you're
do.
in this with us and that, you get the highs and the lows and the struggles of
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
thing called self-care and all of that. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.